Hello, my name is Jermaine Nkrumah, and you're watching Diaspora Network Television. This is Diaspora Weekly, and I am delighted to be joined by Professor Michael Baffle, whose stool name is, and Prof, I'm going to need help again. You're also
Nana
a chief in the Central Region. What's your stool name?
Nana Okoji Amai Dankwa Ameya Kukroko the second.
Oh, that's a mouthful. I'm not going to try to pronounce it, but welcome.
Thank you.
Michael, every time you and I get together, it's policy, it's what can we do for Ghana. You and I go way back with ROPA days, but today the subject matter is Canadian immigration. There was a time when Canada, and I remember when we were in Europe, some of us went to United States, some of us went to Canada. At that time, it looks like the immigration was much better than it is today. We heard that Canada is looking to attract about 500,000 new workers into the country next year. You are there. You're a professor at the University of Winnipeg. Talk to me. University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. Talk to me. Should we apply? Should Africans apply?
We have to put this current announcement, and I think I sent a news clip to you on that. Right. We have to put this in a historical context.
Okay.
What has brought us to this announcement 10 days ago?
Okay.
As I mentioned earlier on, Canada's immigration policy since this country was created in 1867 has, to all intents and purposes, white only policy. So right from the beginning, series of immigration policies and laws that have been passed were geared towards attracting white immigrants, mainly from Northern Europe. So you can talk about Britain, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, those areas. And then earlier on, the Canadians were also scared that the Americans, our cousins to the south, might overrun this part of the continent, what is now called the prairies, that is Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and some part of Alberta, the province of Alberta. So they decided to try and populate this part because Manitoba and Saskatchewan is flat land. So for farming, they brought a lot of immigrants from Ukraine, and they gave them large tracts of land in this part. So most of the farming activities that go on here in the prairies are from the descendants of Ukrainians, right? And so they did not want any immigrants other than white for almost the first 100 years of this country's existence, from 1867 all the way to 1967. Okay. So a few examples. When the country was created, as I mentioned, it's a vast land with 6 time zones. So they decided to link up the country with the construction of a railway line, which they call the Trans-Canada Railway or the Canadian Pacific Railway. And so they were building it from the east, from Nova Scotia, Halifax, all the way through the eastern provinces, through the prairies, ending in Vancouver, British Columbia. Vancouver is just on top of Seattle, right? So when the railway was finished, when they needed labor for the railway line, they needed thousands of laborers for this massive construction work. So where did they go? They went to China and brought a lot of Chinese laborers. And from Canada's immigration literature, you see that they were paid less, or sometimes about half or a quarter of what their white counterparts were being paid. Some of them died and they were buried along the tracks. So by the time that the railway ended, finally in Vancouver, there were about 13,000 Chinese people left from the labor force. But the Canadians decided that they didn't want any more of them. But they also passed a series of laws, one of them actually prohibiting the Chinese men from having sexual relations with white women.
You know what? Yeah, one quick thing. If you want laborers to come and work your railway for them, for you, why don't you do a temporary immigration arrangement with them so that after that they can go back to their country? Clearly, they did not think post railway line scenario, and so they finished with this railway and said, "Oh, we still have 13,000 Chinese left. What are we going to do with them?" Was that the scenario?
Well, that was scenario. It wasn't their welfare that we were thinking of. We were thinking about the labor that they could provide. Family relations and others. No, that didn't matter. We wanted their labor, cheap labor, and that was it. So, as I said, series of immigration laws were passed to restrict further entry of Chinese into the country. One of them was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was around somewhere in 1887, that prohibited Chinese from coming into Canada. And then specifically, since a law has been passed prohibiting sexual relations between Chinese men and white women, the Chinese decided that then they have to sponsor their family members to join them. The Canadian government said no, but you can do that.
There was an actual law that says men from this ethnic group cannot have sexual relationship with women from this group.
Exactly. I'll give you a reference. Later on, you can check. There's a book called The Color of Democracy. It's published by Henry and Tato. You will find what I'm telling you in that book specifically. So the Chinese people said, okay, if we are being restricted this way, then we will bring our family members, our wives, whatever. But the Canadian government said, not so fast. If you want to bring one Chinese person into this country, you pay what is called a head tax. And so officially, a law was passed introducing what we call the Chinese head tax, that any one Chinese person that you bring into this country, 1887, long time ago in Bethlehem, right? You pay $50. Now, Jermaine, think of today, the year 2022.
Today, 2022, I need after this interview, I need $50 from you.
Is that your head tax?
That's your interview tax.
Okay, so imagine what even today in 2022, $50 can buy. Now I can just say that, a bag of 5 kilo rice, $15. A bag of goat meat, $10. So
that time, $15 was like $5,000 today.
Even today, if you go to the grocery store with $50, you can have a whole week's grocery shopping, right? And so if in 1887, you were asking the Chinese to pay $50 per person before they can sponsor their family members, that was, to all intents and purposes, cruel. Wow. Anyway, it didn't end there. The Chinese, they proved smart. So what they did was they formed some kind of credit unions, and then they will collect money among themselves. When they get $50, they will give it to one person to bring their family members. And then the Canadian government said, you guys want to be smart? In 1903, they increased the head tax to $500. Again, imagine what $500 can do today, and think about 1903. So this remained on the Canadian law books until 1923, before the Chinese head tax was abolished. Anyway, so I'm just taking a couple of ethnic groups to show you the answer to your question that Canada used to welcome everybody. So this is the Chinese. They were excluding them. Laws, the Chinese Exclusion Act, excluding them. Then they passed another law, which specifically was targeted against South Asians. And under that, the law described any group of people that at the point of entry, an immigration officer would deem undesirable to Canada. So that was an undesirable act. Yeah. And so if you arrive at any port of entry, air, land, sea, whatever, and in the opinion of the Canadian Customs Immigration Officer that you meet, you are among those categories that has been classified as undesirable, who cannot easily assimilate into Canada, then you are denied entry.
Were there any guidance as to what constitute undesirable, or was it that
yes,
if I had a fight, if I had a fight with my wife that morning and I was in a bad mood, that reflected on the number of undesirables that I characterized?
Well, we can have that analogy, but the point is that they listed anybody from South Asia who is not white.
Okay.
Right? And so the undesirable, the actual wording in the law is that any person whose religion, ethnicity, nationality make them unsuitable for assimilation into Canada. So that's what they had in mind.
Wow.
Anyway, so that law was passed, the undesirables. And then they follow it up with another law called the Continuous Passage Act, that anybody who arrived in Canada at the port of entry, your passport should have shown that you didn't stop anywhere before arriving here. And you know that you cannot come from anywhere, Africa or Asia, without stopping somewhere before you get to Canada, right?
Yeah.
So that effectively eliminated anybody coming from Africa or Asia. That was the Continuous Passage Act.
Wow.
That law also required that anybody from South Asia who arrived in Canada should have, around that time, 1897 or so, a minimum of $200 in their pocket on arrival. So all these were exclusionary measures, right?
Okay.
So again, I've given you a little background about how and why we didn't want Asians. Now I'm back to blacks, you and I.
Mm-hmm.
Blacks came to Canada through the abolition of the slave trade, right? When the slave trade was abolished, a lot of slave owners in US didn't agree. So they were still keeping slaves. Mm-hmm. And some of the slaves were escaping. So in 1850, the US actually passed a law called the Slave Fugitive Act. Under that, if you escape from your slave master and you are caught, you can be fined or jailed or both. So a lot of the blacks were escaping to come to Canada through what was called the Underground Railway, which was not actually a railway line.
Yeah, Harry Tubman
actually identified a series of safe houses where they could hide during the day and then travel in the night before they go to Canada. So that's how a lot of blacks ended up in Canada, many of them first in Nova Scotia. But they were treated so badly, the white people in Nova Scotia didn't want black children to go to the same school with their children. The blacks were prevented from owning property. So they were treated so badly that in 1793, about 1,200 of them actually left Nova Scotia to what is now Sierra Leone in West Africa.
Okay.
And then the settlement where the blacks were living in Halifax, called Africville, was actually burnt down. Now today, if you go to Halifax in Nova Scotia, there's a park by the water, and there's only a plaque. This is where Africville once stood. The whole neighborhood was burnt down, and the only thing they have to their name now is a plaque where that neighborhood once.
So the image that Canada has around the world of being this liberal, tolerant society, is it deceptive?
Well, to some extent, yes. Even today, see, Canada projects the image of, no, we don't do no wrong, right? We are peacekeepers. When people are misbehaving around the world and they are fighting, we go and play peacekeeping roles, right? But that is another story. But when it comes to migration, the point is that we didn't want people other than white in this country when it was created in 1867 for close to 100 years. Okay, so let me fast track. Now, in 1947, the then Prime Minister of Canada, his name was Mackenzie King, he stood in the Canadian Parliament called the House of Commons and declared that any significant migration from the Orient, now he's talking about Asia, any significant migration from the Orient will likely disrupt the racial composition of this country. Right. So the Prime Minister himself decided that they didn't want people from the Orient, Asia, to come to Canada. This was as recently as 1947.
Okay.
So let's move forward now. By 1967, Canada realized that this series of racist immigration laws were indefensible, and it wasn't doing the country any good image.
Did they realize it on their own? Did they realize it on their own, or something happened?
Well, there will be pressure from the international community, right? You go to conferences, you can't make noise that you are tolerant when you have all these discriminatory laws on your books, right? Okay. So I think pressure from the international community actually helped the Canadians to loosen that those laws. Now, looking at the situation of blacks again, in 1956, Canada decided that they had, now this is linked to the question that you asked about current immigration levels. Canada decided that they needed domestic help, domestic labor. So they went to the Caribbean and announced that Canada has introduced a domestic scheme under which it needed young, single, unmarried women to come to Canada to work as domestics. And you know that black people will do anything, right? So even if you were married, you have to, on the form, you have to lie that you are not married, you don't have children, you don't have a husband. Because if you say that you are married, you don't qualify.
Yes.
So through that, from 1956, thousands and thousands of Caribbean women came to this country under the domestic scheme. And under the terms of the conditions of service, they were supposed to work for a number of years, maximum 5 years, and then they can apply to become permanent residents. But you have to do so with the approval and support of your employer. And most of the employers, the rich white men, they decided that no, if you sign a paper to get a permanent resident, you leave, right? But we wanted your cheap labor. So many of them stayed in that situation for 7, 8 years, 9 years, and even in some cases 10 years before they managed to get their residency regularized. So you see that blacks have not fared any better in this country. So in the East, especially Montreal and Toronto, Ontario and Quebec, there are a lot of blacks who are in that, they all came, or they are the descendants of those who came as domestics. Yeah. So unlike Africa and sometimes Asia or even Latin America, where migration into North America has been male-led, right? That's the men go first, and later on when they get settled, they bring their spouses. The Caribbean migration was female-led. It was the women who came first under the domestic scheme, and then later on, well, if they stay for about 5 years, 7 years, maybe at that time their marriages have even broken down back home. So this has been the plight of blacks in.
All right.
What's cool, fresh and trendy with a new look? Makes you feel real good, that refreshing vibe. Satisfies you right just the way you like. Do you know? Do you know? Do you know? You gotta do it alone. Specialized makes you flow. Anytime, anywhere. Natural mineral water. Feel different. Think special. This advertisement has been vetted and approved by the FDA.
Now, I do know that in the mid-80s, in the 80s, 1980s, there was significant traffic of Ghanaians that I happen to know, mostly from Europe to Canada. What mechanism brought them there?
Most of them who came, especially from the mid-1980s, 1985, 86, 87, that was during the heat of the Rawlings regime, right?
Okay.
So most of them came as refugees. I mean, whether they were being persecuted, I mean, there were a lot of turbulence, but It's possible that not everybody was, but
Ah.
that period up to about 1991, 92, most of the Ghanaians who came from Ghana, West Africa, Nigeria, especially from Libya,
political asylum.
Yeah, they came here as asylum seekers.
Okay, good. Now, there is something that happened after the 9/11 event in New York and Washington. I remember that Muslims were very, very fearful. I mean, you almost all Muslims in the United States were indoors because they didn't want to be seen outside. It wasn't a good time for Muslims in the United States. And I remember me and a couple of my friends, we took a trip to Toronto. And we arrived at Toronto Airport. The moment we got out, we saw police officers in turbans. And I remember looking at my friends and said, wait a minute, what's going on here? That picture stuck in my head that, wait a minute, maybe Canada is very, very liberal when it comes to immigration. Did I read things wrong?
Well, that what you saw, that was the end of the discrimination against, you are talking about Sikhs, right? In turbans.
Right.
Yeah. They have been excluded from the police force for many, many years, and it has been a series of fights, legal challenges, and they were granted the right to wear their traditional turban in the police force. Well, it's not more than 15 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. So maybe around the time that
this was 2001 thereabouts.
Yeah.
Okay. So now, what do we make of this? Now, it's important that you gave us this historical context, because it seems like when Canada needs people, they'll bring you in, and then once you get there, they're scratching their head. Okay, wait a minute, what do we do with these people? This new set of immigrants, and I won't call them new, because I think every year they have a quota of immigrants to bring in and everything. Should these new people coming in expect that once they get there and Canada doesn't have any more need for them, there are going to be a series of laws to make their life difficult?
Okay, see, I was painting you a picture, a scenario, a flight path, which brought us to 10 days ago with that 500,000 announcement.
Right.
So I told you that for the first 100 years of the life of this country, the policy was mainly whites-only policy. And then I mentioned that it came to a point where it was indefensible. So in 1967, we introduced a new immigration act, which was classified as an open door policy. So 1967, now Canada is saying that now we encourage migration to Canada from sources that were hitherto not allowed.
Okay.
And that law in 1967 introduced what we call the points system. So under that, if you have education up to a certain level, undergraduate degree, master's or PhD, or even, let's say, high school, you get a certain number of points for every category of education that you have.
Okay.
If you have skills that Canada needs at the time that you are applying, you get X number of points. If you speak one or two of the two official languages of this country, English or French, you get X number of points. If the particular skill that you have is in need in Canada at the very time that you are applying, you get X number of points. Now, when you total all that and you get 62, it doesn't mean that you are coming. It qualifies you for an interview with an immigration officer.
Okay.
Right? Now, listen to this interesting thing. 1967, all the way up to 1993, the whole of Canada, the whole of Africa had 2 Canadian consular offices. Although Canada had high commissions and embassies in other countries in Africa, of the 54 countries in Africa, Canada had only 2 consular offices, one in Abidjan and one in Nairobi, Kenya.
Wait, so, what year is this?
Pardon?
What year is this?
Well, from that whole time that they introduced this point system until...
The point system, 1967. Okay, go ahead.
Up to about 1992.
Wow.
Although Canada had embassies and high commissions across the 54 countries of Africa, it had only 2 consular offices. Where you are in Ghana, there has been a Canadian High Commission there for many years, but it had no consular section. So if you are in Ghana and you want to apply for visa to come to Canada, you have to travel to Abidjan, which is the closest. So all those 17 countries in West Africa, their Canadian consular office was in Abidjan. So it was through myself and other immigration advocates when we were in Montreal that advocated for the Canadians to open a consular section at the Canadian High Commission in Accra in 1994. It's just recently.
Wow.
So the consular section at the Canadian High Commission in Accra was only from the mid-1990s. Before the High Commission was there.
Did they also open more consular sections, or they just did that to pacify?
No, because for a long time, and I don't know about now, for a long time, until recently, the Nigerians, when we opened the consular section in Accra, at the Canadian High Commission in Accra, all Nigerians who needed visa or who
were coming there.
Were coming to Accra for their visas.
Wow.
It was just recently that they have upgraded, I think, the Abuja High Commission to a consular level that they can apply in their own country.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Okay, don't be shocked. Hold on, fasten your seatbelt. Listen to the next thing. You know that Britain, quote unquote, owned Hong Kong, right? For many years.
Right.
And they had signed an agreement with the Chinese government that they will hand over Hong Kong to China in 1997.
Right.
So during the period of Margaret Thatcher, they were making preparations in the early 90s, mid-90s to hand over Hong Kong to back to China. And the Chinese people in Hong Kong, they were fantabulously rich. So they were scared that if China took over, they're going to lose their money. So many of them now decided, which is the safest place around the world for us to take our money to? Canada said, bingo, we got it. So Canada opened as many as 10 consular offices in that tiny Hong Kong alone.
You've got to be kidding me.
Yes.
Hong Kong. So, Hong Kong is, from what I understand, Hong Kong is not even a quarter of Accra.
Yeah.
And so they had 10 consulates.
Canada had 10 consular offices in the city of Hong Kong alone. And all this time, this particular time, mid-1990s, Canada had only 2 consular offices in the whole of the 54 countries in Africa.
Wow.
Now it gets more juicier. Listen, the policy of Canada and why we open 10 consular offices in Hong Kong is that you are Chinese, you have money. If you can show us that you have $250,000 or more to invest in Canada, you are in. We don't care how you got the money, but if you can invest $250,000. So we wanted the money that these Hong Kong Chinese people had. And so that was the reason why we opened so many consular offices in Hong Kong. So if you contrast it to what was happening in Africa. So I'm answering your question as to whether you were welcoming to other people. We didn't want to. And the irony of this is that the same Chinese people that we didn't want, on whose head we placed the tax.
Yeah.
Now we want their money so they could come. Now you go to Vancouver now, you'll be amazed. It's almost a Chinese city. Where the Vancouver airport is now, there was a neighborhood called Richmond. It's more or less a vast tract of farmland. So the Chinese people came with their money and they bought up the whole place. So now if you come out of the Vancouver airport, once you start driving, you will think you may be in some Chinese city.
And they have Chinese signs, Chinese road signs and everything.
Exactly. So the Chinese came, they bought up the whole of Vancouver. So now that is why accommodation is very, very expensive in Vancouver.
So what do we make of this announcement now? Because Ghanaians hear this and they say, okay, Canada is inviting us.
Okay. So I'll give you the picture who we wanted at one point and who we didn't want until 1967, where the points system came in.
Right.
And then when you get X number of points, you qualify for an interview. It doesn't mean that you are coming. And the reason why I brought that analogy of only 2 consular offices across Canada, there was this Canadian immigration officer stationed in the High Commission in Nairobi. So every 6 months or half of the year, he will buy a bunch of air tickets in his pocket and we travel to other places across Africa, Tanzania, all those places to interview immigrants who have applied. He might even come to Abidjan, right? I'll refer you to, later on, you can Google, there's a movie that was made by Canada itself, the Canadian National Film Board. It was called Who Gets In?
Okay. Who gets
Go
in?
and take a look at it and you'll be saddened as to the racist nature of this migration officer and his other officers to Africans who were applying to migrate. There was one particular incident that in my classes, I teach with that example all the time. He told one person who was applying that, well, Canada want immigrants and good immigrants. And when they go to Canada, they're not just going to live in anywhere. They're going to live close to my grandmother, and we don't want any more rascals. We have enough rascals of our own. Yeah, go online and Google that movie by the Canadian National Film Board.
Was the movie exaggerated or is it a reflection?
It wasn't exaggerated. The guy knew that, and what I'm saying, that the authenticity of that rests in the fact that it was made by a Canadian film agency, the Canadian National Film Board, and they were trying to take a look as to how Canada's migration system is working overseas. And they were interviewing this guy, and he didn't care that he was being recorded.
So now let me ask you this then. First towards the Chinese and the point system, then and then the Caribbean, and then all this. When is it going to be a targeted immigration policy to attract Africans? To Canada.
So, in Canada, we have 10 provinces, like your regions in Ghana, right? We have 10 provinces and 3 territories in the north. And for some time, from 1978, the province of Quebec, the French section, negotiated with the Canadian government, the federal government, and then Quebec got their own migration policy under which they could select the immigrants that they want. Because Quebec has always felt threatened that there's this one French-speaking province in what they call a Sea of English. So what the Quebec government, after they got that power from the federal government, they went to North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and then Syria, Lebanon, and then they selected immigrants from there because the Arabs, North America, they look white, right? And Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and they speak French. So they felt that they could fit in better there. So Quebec, through that, increased its share of the Canadian population. And by 1995, Quebec had a quarter of the whole Canadian population. At that time, the Canadian population was 25 million, and Quebec had about 6 million. So at some point, the other provinces also realized that there's only 2 ways that you can populate a country or a territory. Either you give birth naturally or you import people through migration. And so that is when they also realized that Quebec, through its negotiation with the federal government getting this power, is now ahead, right? You need more people to be able to engage in production. You need more people to engage in housing, building, construction. And you need people to buy things to prop up the economy. So the other provinces also started negotiating with the federal government. And in the early 2003, Ontario, Manitoba, they also got those powers. And they introduced what they call the Provincial Nominee Programs, under which anybody who is already a Canadian citizen or permanent resident could nominate somebody from outside to come. And that particular program has helped a lot of these provinces now also to increase their population. When I came to Manitoba in 2006, the population of the whole province of Manitoba was only 900,000, and about 700,000 of them were living in Winnipeg, the capital city. Today that I'm talking to you, the population of Manitoba is about 1.4 million. So within a period of 15 years, there has been an increase of about 500,000 through migration. Because what they were saying was that they're going to increase the number of immigrants they were bringing to this country to prop up
Did Africans take care of the nominee program?
Oh yeah, a lot of people have, a lot of Africans took advantage of that and they sponsored their family members. But at some point, they got into a clash with the federal government because the federal government was saying that a lot of the provinces were using that program as family reunification. But that program was skills targeted to attract skilled immigrants. Okay, so that is currently ongoing, that people are still using the provincial nominee program. Now, The Canadian government, through these restrictive measures, from 1990, Canada introduced migration targets. So they said that from 1990, for every 5-year cycle, they will increase the level of migration to 1% of the total Canadian population. Okay. So 1990 to 1994, the Canadian population was 25 million. So they were going to bring in 250,000 immigrants for that year, which is 1% of the population.
Right.
So that went on. We never met those targets anyway, but every year they will set the targets. Now, 4 years ago, they set a target as 300,000. Well, they didn't meet it. Then 3 years ago, the target was 350,000. Well, they didn't meet it. At the end of the year, they don't meet it. Then last year, they set a target of 400,000. That is, we're going to bring in 400,000 immigrants per year, because they realize that if we don't, the population is aging. So you need people to work to be able to sustain the pension fund, especially. And also, you need people to work to grow the economy. And the only way you can do that is either to give birth naturally or you bring people. Now, there was a funny thing when I used to be in Quebec. The Quebec government introduced a policy. They call it cash for babies. So if you give birth to the first child, you get $6,000 bonus. The second child, you get $5,000 bonus. The fourth child, you get $4,000 bonus. So that was an attempt to encourage the French women to produce babies. And then the women got angry. So what do you think of us? Baby producing machines? So
really,
the French women, they didn't give a damn about that. But that was the intention of the Quebec government, to get the population to produce babies. So our good friends from South Asia, Pakistanis, Indians, Sri Lankans, Bangladesh, they got busy. So they were producing children every 9 months. They were producing children.
Wait, though. So if you have twins, that's $12,000.
Sure, right. So after about 5 years, the Quebec government realized that no, these are not the babies that we had in mind.
Okay.
So they canceled the policy.
Wow.
Yes.
So it's almost like everything is racist.
Well, you can call it that if you want. Anyway, back to the present. So, as I said, we have set series of migration targets every year, which we have actually not met. Now we have realized that there's acute labor shortage in this country. There are so many sectors that need skilled workers. We don't have them. But over the years too, if you go to any Canadian embassy or high commission around the world, you see all these nicely glossy printed papers, encouraging people to migrate to Canada. We want doctors, we want engineers, we want teachers, we want nurses. And some people around the world, they will sell their businesses and their properties and they will come. Doctors, when they get here, the Canadian government will say, oh, you are a doctor. Well, the government, we don't hire doctors. You have to apply to the Canadian College of Physicians. And that's where the trouble started. So, every occupation, the higher level of income in that occupational category is demand and supply, right? So the Canadian College of Physicians, they realize that if they bring in more doctors from outside, then maybe it will lower their status or remunerations. And in most small towns around the country, there's a shortage of doctors. There are clinics and hospitals that they don't have doctors. But when they come and the Canadian government push these professionals to the colleges, the College of Physicians, the College of Engineers, College of Architects, then they'll make it impossible for them to pass whatever exams that they set for them. So in this country, there's this touching problem. We call it non-recognition of foreign credentials. If you arrive in any Canadian city and you take a car from the airport, engage the taxi driver in a conversation, you will realize that he was a doctor where he came from. He was an engineer where he came from. He was a teacher where he came from. They have become so frustrated in the system that they cannot find jobs in the areas that they train, in the areas that they were convinced to apply to come. So now, at least 2 of the Canadian provinces, Ontario and Manitoba, have taken some very significant positive steps. They have established what they call the Office of the Fairness Commissioner. And the Office of the Fairness Commissioner is supposed to liaise with these professional bodies and to design proper and smooth ways to get foreign credentials recognized in Canada. Because the education system of Canada is British, right? Same thing you have in Ghana, same thing you have in India. So why is it that when people get trained there and they come here, we don't want to recognize them? So that has been one of the sticky points here, non-recognition of foreign training credentials. So all this combined, the non-recognition of foreign credentials and all this previous whites-only policy and discrimination policy, this is what has brought Canada to where we are today, which led to first, 2 weeks ago, last Friday, the Minister of Immigration announced that with the effect from 2nd of November, international students in this country are now allowed to work as many hours as possible as they want. Before, if you're an international student and you are given a study permit, you are allowed to work only for 20 hours a week. And sometimes that work was restricted only to the campus of the education institution where you were studying. But now they say that international students, and when the minister was making the announcement, he said specifically to alleviate, temporarily alleviate the acute labor shortage. We are now encouraging international students to work as many as possible. And it's estimated that it's estimated that there are about 650,000 international students in this country, and they are highly skilled, right? Undergraduates, graduates, and so on. So we think that that will temporarily help solve our labor shortage.
Do you think Canada will ever learn from its mistakes, or do they even think they're making mistakes in the immigration arena?
Well, we have learned. I think that when politicians are making policy announcements, they don't do so with announcement also of their past and the mistakes that they have done, or that they are saying that they will make them feel good. That you see how good we are now. We are allowing international students to work as many hours that they can, first to help them financially pay for the education, and also to help us temporarily solve our labor shortage. So this was 3 weeks ago. And then 10 days ago, the minister further announced that to solve or help solve partially the acute labor shortage in all categories, now we're going to increase the level of immigrants that we bring to this country every year. So I think now they have increased the percentage. I told you before that you were bringing 1%. But the last census, Canada's population is approaching 40 million. So if you are bringing 500,000, then
that's
it's a little bit above 1.5.
Okay.
Whatever. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Cool, fresh and trendy with a new look. Makes you feel real good, that refreshing vibe. Satisfies you right just the way you like. Do you know? Do you know? Do you know? Ain't gotta do it alone. Specialized makes you flow. Anytime. Natural mineral water. Feel different. Think special. This advertisement has been vetted and approved by the FDA.
The message that I want to you through your medium to give to people in Ghana, that it is not that it's just open that everybody can come. There's an application process, right? And we want immigrants, and we want skilled immigrants, because the announcement was specifically to solve the labor shortage, not ordinary labor, right? But you are strong, so you can carry things.
That's good.
We need people to do that. Every springtime, from April, May, June, July, August, we bring a lot of South Americans from Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia. They come here as farm workers to harvest our produce, right? That is there, the temporary foreign workers.
So what's the application process? If I'm in Ghana, I want to come to Canada, what do I do?
Now every application is online. You don't have to go to the Canadian High Commission again.
Okay.
You go to the Government of Canada website, and then you will see if you're applying as a skilled worker, it will list the
categories
categories.
that need it. Okay.
Categories, yeah, you belong to, what skills you have, what languages you speak, and so on and so forth. And then you have to watch and pray.
Okay. It seems you and a group of your friends were successful in advocating for additional consular offices to be opened on the African soil. Maybe this is the time, in light of the racist historical narration of what Canada has done in its immigration. Maybe this is the time for you and your friends to get busy again and say, look, historically, your immigration has not favored Africans. What are you going to do about that? Is that in the cards?
We are not planning to do that, but the point is that we are monitoring, because at least some of those things are public information that we can find. Let's say for the past 3 years, when we had targets of 350,000 and 400,000, how many people came and which were the source countries? Now, interestingly, the census that was done in 2020, which now showed that we are getting closer to 40 million, it showed that 25% of the total Canadian population are immigrants, right? Okay. A quarter. Yeah, okay. So it means that the demographic landscape is changing. And way back, I think the 2016 census also showed that by the year 2031, 63% of the population of Ontario will be what is classified in Canada as visible minority.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So I think we are not doing badly.
Okay. So question.
Yes. Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay. Question. If the immigration is by percentage, right?
Yeah.
So now the running percentage is 1.25. Shouldn't there, and this is for your advocacy, shouldn't it be that, look, Canada's population, let's say 10, 15% is of people from African descent. So maybe this 500,000 people, it should be proportional. 15% should come from areas where people of African descent should come. Can you make that argument to them?
Well, what we are doing currently, myself and a group of Africans, academics and community leaders are doing, is to advocate for fair access to the labor market. Okay. Right? We're working on this non-recognition of foreign credentials and so on. So where I am, the province of Manitoba, a couple of years back, we had a meeting with the premier of the province at the time, and he said that they have set targets. They want about 9% of the public service to be of indigenous descent and 7% being visible minorities. And the visible minority, officially, the classification of visible minority in Canada is anybody other than indigenous or white. So Africans, Asians, Latinos are classified as visible minority. So that is the advocacy that we're currently doing. But what I'm saying is that we also monitor to see the levels, the announcement that they made, the levels, how many people will actually come into this country at the end of 2023. Okay. Whether they met the 500,000 and what was the ethnic composition of these immigrants. But what I will advise is that anybody in Africa, in Ghana, who wants to apply, just check the Canadian government website. You see whatever qualifications that they have there for application for immigrants, because it's not just that they want immigrants, they want skilled immigrants. Immigrants, okay. No, your country, the United States, right? Mm-hmm. The United States, I like those guys, because the point is that despite all the Trumpism, they have a very, 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 let's say, I would say, smart immigration policy. Canada is, let's say, maximum, let's say we are 40 million. The United States officially is 325 million, and according to Lou Dobbs and his group of people, they are 14, 15 million illegal aliens, wherever they came from. Yeah. And then, but in spite of that, almost 350 million people, every year, they engage in this US visa lottery, which brings into the US about 700,000 every year. That's
Yeah.
smartness, right?
Yeah.
Because the US government has realized that that's the only way you can be powerful. There's strength and power in numbers.
People are not having babies, and that's why they're canceling abortion and all that stuff.
Exactly.
Okay,
And
so in our final maybe 5 minutes or so now, you've educated us about immigration. That's how people get in. But once I get in, what's in store for me? What's race relations in Canada like?
oh well, at least I can say that we are better than our cousins down south. But sometimes I like them because in your country, the United States, they will tell you
My
in your
country
face.
is Ghana.
Yeah.
I live there. Yes.
In the US, they will tell you in your face that they don't like you, right? So sometimes I'm comfortable with that. But what is dangerous is the insidious nature of racism and discrimination, where you pretend that everybody is okay, but in actual fact, all kinds of impediments are put in your way when it comes to integration, access to the labor market, and so on and so forth, right? So those challenges are there.
Okay.
Canada has done a lot of good stuff. In 1994, we passed what we call the Employment Equity Act, because there was a realization that when it comes to employment, the labor field was not even for everybody. So that particular law, 1994, the Employment Equity Act, was passed specifically to make sure that when it comes to employment, minorities should also have a fair playing field.
Okay.
But Jermaine, you're a policy guy. You know that laws themselves don't get up to implement themselves. You have to have the people to have the goodwill and the motivation to implement the law.
You almost choked me. Say that again. Laws themselves don't implement themselves. Do you remember a certain law in Ghana called ROPA?
Yeah, ROPA never implemented itself, right? We passed it with all fanfare. How many years ago? 18 years?
2006. Yeah.
Yeah. 16 years ago.
16 years ago, yeah.
No, 2005,
right.
2006, February.
It was signed in February 2006.
Yeah, and this is where we are.
ROPA
has not implemented itself. Despite the court challenges, despite the strong advocacy from people like you who went to Ghana at some point, engaged with the Electoral Commission and the rest, no government, including our current government, has shown any goodwill towards implementing ROPA. Yeah. And you and I, when the last time we engaged in conversation, we talk about it, that this is not smartness. Any country around the world which is smart, they have actively encouraged their diaspora to become part of the development of the country.
We're gonna, but quickly, we don't hear about police brutality in Canada. Is it happening and it's not reported, or it's not happening?
Oh, occasionally you have some rogue police officers who engage in those kind of things, especially in Vancouver with the Asians, and in Toronto, Ontario. The police force, you have some brutalities coming from time to time, but it's not as pronounced as what we witness and hear down south. So, but the point is that you just have to be careful yourself, because if you encounter the police at a corner where there's nobody there, whatever happens to you is your word against them, right?
Yeah.
So, but again, the answer to your question is that it's not as pronounced here.
Okay.
Here, the race relationship is better.
It's better.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Michael, as always, you've shown that you're a professor. This is one of those interviews that I didn't have to ask much. You've educated us, and on behalf of my audience, I really want to thank you for being generous with information. I think people who listen to this interview will be very well equipped if they're looking to migrate to Canada. So on that note, I want to thank you, Michael. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. And it's about 9 p.m. your time in Ghana?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. It's 6 minutes after 3 here.
Oh, okay.
And we had our first bout of snow yesterday.
Oh, snow.
Yes.
Well, I tell you what, I don't have to worry about it here in Accra. I don't have to worry about it in Texas. So enjoy your snow.
Okay, thank you. I will. And all the best.
All right, thanks.
Okay.